Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel for a Distress Ink background video. I am going to make some kind of spring cards with these backgrounds. So I tried to pick spring colors for the backgrounds. I'm using a jelly plate as my base to work on because I really like that. I find it's quite easy, but you can use any surface to put your inks on. I'm starting with there is a bit of a green pigment on my card. I think that was a brush or pigment maybe. I'm starting with the typical technique you use with distress inks, squishing the ink pad to your surface, adding water, maybe mixing the colors or not, and then I dip in my paper. The paper I'm using is the Canson Mixed Media paper. It's a 200 GSM, very smooth paper. I really like it when I do greeting cards and for stamping because it's very smooth and not so textured, and you get a good stamp impression. It works not as good as watercolor paper, but it works just fine. So sometimes I would use the Canson XL watercolor paper, and sometimes I use the Canson mixed media paper. I just experiment with the colors. I try to name them in the video description, so you can check that out. This is, I think, spiced marmalade. The prints I made and the backgrounds I made with that spiced marmalade are the less springy. Even if I tried not to use more autumnal colors on these backgrounds, they turned out quite autumnal. But the rest turns out really lovely for spring, I think. I did the recording of this video live, not live, but directly from the studio in German, so that's why sometimes I seem to explain things, but that does not match what I'm talking here in English, so I hope you don't mind that. I try to pick springy colors such as the crushed olive, lighter colors. Here I have the bundle sage and the crushed olive together on the plate. I picked most are distress inks, but I also have some distress oxides. I'm going to use the oxides towards the end because they have some kind of white pigment in them, which always comes to the top. So if you lay down an oxide and then you would lay an ink directly over the top, the oxide pigments would flow onto the surface. So it's always on the top, it's always the dominant color, and it also has some opacity because of the white. So that's the reason why I always use oxides towards the end as my latest layers, because I don't want to dull down the distress inks. The distress inks are very vibrant and shiny and bright, and the oxides are more muted. And yeah, that's why I do this in this way. I also have the worn lipstick, the picked raspberry, and I put out the mustard seed, but I'm not ending up using it. I also have the dried marigold and the Victorian velvet that I'm using. And for the blue, I think spring always needs a light blue. I picked the broken china. I think that's the perfect color for spring because the sky often is a little bit dusky, but blue, but very light blue. But I'm not a big fan of baby blue, and I feel a turquoisey blue would be more an autumn sky. Not sure why, but for me it's like that. I also picked some darker colors to bring in contrast later to the backgrounds, and therefore I will use the walnut stain in Distress Ink and the forest moss. I'm thinking about when my first layers are finished, I always try to let every layer dry, maybe sometimes not 100%. And then I think about which color might fit the color I have already on the card. And here I think that was the dried marigold, and I picked down the Victorian velvet and the worn lipstick, and I really love that color combination. I think maybe I should write down color combos with the Distress ink that I like, but I never do. And then every time I do Distress ink backgrounds, it's a surprise. And I don't like that green spot there, but I would just use green as my next layer to cover that up and make it more invisible. Please check the video description. There is a link to the blog post where you can have a look at all the finished backgrounds. I also will put in the materials I've been using, and I will name the Distress ink pads and oxide pads I used for these backgrounds. I decided to pick that bundle sage for these orangish backgrounds because I felt they were too much towards autumn, and then I thought that might help making them more springtime looking. I think for one it turned out quite nice, and I had one left at the end that was, I think, a little bit too much fall-like, autumn-like, so I put this aside. Yesterday I made the cards with these backgrounds, and I will post those cards all over on our shop blog during the next weeks. You will also see them posted on Instagram, so you can see how I'm using these backgrounds. Of course, you don't have to make greeting card backgrounds with these techniques. You can also use the same technique in your art journal. I then would recommend using maybe a mini jelly plate that is adhered to an acrylic block, and then you can do the Distress ink smushing the other way around. That's what I do a lot when I do a Distress ink background in my journal. I had two cards where I had the crushed olive combined with the bundled sage, and I just did the other ones, and for these two I'm using the picked raspberry. I think on the other ones I used the dried marigold and the worn lipstick, if I'm not wrong. And I really like that. That reminds me of springtime, maybe Easter. These would also be good Easter cards, but I needed some birthday cards, and I also made some thank you cards and some just greeting cards that you can use for different occasions. So yeah, I really love these. These are my favorites because I think color wise, what I also tried with these backgrounds this time is I didn't want to cover them fully. I wanted to leave some white space just to make them look lighter and more, yeah, not as covered in ink and heavy, more light, and I don't know how to describe it, but it's like in spring. You feel lighter, everything is more open, and whilst for an autumnal color or background, I would use more ink, more warm colors. Yeah. I really like these two. There is a bigger white spot at the bottom right, on the right side, on the right card, and I will add something to this. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm going through the backgrounds and think of which color I want to add next. I try to often pick complementaries to make it interesting. I think about if I need more contrast to bring in darker colors. That's what I'm also doing towards the end of a process. Sometimes I turn my cards around and think about what I like and what I don't like, and then I would try to cover the areas up that I'm not happy with. These two I think are super pretty, and I will only add some green to cover up that spot I had here. And yeah, that's what I'm doing. That's how I work my way through the backgrounds. I always try to make more backgrounds at once because then this reduces the drying time, and if there is something that needs to get dry in between, I would just use my heat tool quickly to get that dry. I'm now working on the cards I put aside where I think things are missing, and I try to change these up a bit. The first one I made I liked, but this one is not what I like. It's just everything looks so evenly boring but still messy, and I really like this one. I think that's pretty now, and it also goes towards spring, and not sure what's going on with this background. Maybe I will add a layer to this one as well. Yeah, it looks like. I think I picked the Warm lipstick again. It's one of my favorite pink colors. It's such a lovely pink. It's not as shiny and bright as the picked raspberry. It's more a little bit muted, but still a pretty pink. I like this card now. I think that's also a really nice background. I add a little bit more onto this one. I also like this one. And the last one that I had just shown you, that one. I don't like it. And I will try to fix it later with more contrast, with a darker color. I'm now going in with green onto these reddish orangish cards. Oh no, I'm not going on with green. I will do that. But now as the cards are dry, I wanted to add a little bit of texture to them. As we are working with Distress inks, you can use water to get them reactivated and make some interesting textures. You can make water splatters, and you can also do what I am doing here. I'm using a stencil and I'm spritzing water through the stencil onto the backgrounds. Let that sit for a while, and then I would pick up the water with a paper towel, and that will leave a ghosty kind of image. And that's really nice to bring in some interest on the background, some things you can discover whilst looking at it. And here I'm just using the wet stencil and I press it onto the card. That will do the same thing. Here I'm making just some splatters, which also works quite nicely. And what you also can do is just add some water to your working surface, use a stamp, dip that in water, and then stamp it to your background. That will also leave a ghost kind of image. I'm using our mini texture stencil today. These are 4 stencil in one, and I've cut mine apart. You don't have to cut them apart, but you can. I prefer this. I really like these mini stencils. They are great to work with in an art journal, especially if it's a smaller journal. And I'm doing the same here. I'm spritzing the water through the stencil onto the card, or I spritz the stencil with water and then I stamp with it onto the paper, onto the background. This is a stencil from our mini ink dots. There are 3 patterns on this stencil, and I also cut these three apart. And now I pick the water up with my paper towel, and you can see where the stencil, the water, left some pattern or textures. That's a really good way to bring in a bit more interest than just the color. This was the one with the splatters, I think. I just added some splatters with a brush. That also works very nice. What you also can do is mixing things up if you make a fuller background. That would not work with my spring themed backgrounds, but you can just create something like that and then add water, dry it, and then add more ink and add water again. And that will give you a really deep background with texture. I really like that dot pattern from the mini textures. I think that looks quite cool. And I remember I also really like the mini ink dots. It's just lovely to experiment with different patterns on the backgrounds. These were 5 of my 8 backgrounds I made, and I still have these 3 where I wasn't happy with, and I will now try to do something to make them better, make them more interesting and usable. But even if you end up with a background that is not so good, it's not a problem at all. That will always happen sometimes. I don't mind that. A good thing what you can do with these kind of backgrounds is use them for die cutting. For example, you can die cut some leafy shapes or flowers, and these will look so interesting and pretty. For the 2 I really liked, I'm adding also some texture by spritzing water through a stencil onto the background. I'm using another one of the mini ink dots stencils. I'm now going to remove the water from the backgrounds to see how the texture looks. Really love that. I think it's such a lovely and interesting technique, and also the textures are quite nice. And as it makes it lighter, it's perfect for these spring cards. That's one of my favorites now, I would say. And that's the only one I don't like. I added some splatters to it. I'm just dipping up the water now, and it's so boring. I definitely need to add more color, and I'm going with the picked raspberry because I wanted something intense that shows up, that gives me some contrast maybe. And yeah, that worked quite nicely contrast wise. But as I said, this background will in the end turn out quite autumnal, and I didn't use it for the spring cards I made, but I will keep it, and then I can use it for an autumn card later in the year. It's now time to add in another layer. I'm starting out with these backgrounds where I wanted to add the green. I'm using forest moss. I'm using a dark green to bring in contrast. I think using a light green might also be nice, but I am a big fan of a higher contrast, and that's what I'm doing here. And I really like the contrast I'm getting. I think it's also okay to bring in some contrast into spring. For me, you always have these bright and light, fresh colors from the first flowers you see growing, and you always have that messy, dark earth and grass that's still left from from the year before. And I think then it's perfect to bring in something dark and muddy maybe in, as a contrast to the bright and fresh colors. I really like that bottom part here. Looks like a piece of moss, I think. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm adding more contrast to the cards. I think about if I need it or if I like the backgrounds as they are. For example, here they are quite contrasting. I think they look really nice. Just the left one with the big white spot. There I think could be something. And I'm going for the broken china in the oxide version. I think that's the first time I'm using the oxides. And I will add this because that symbolizes the sky for me, and I think it goes perfect with the other colors. Whenever something does not turn out the way I want it, I can use the brush and just go in there and move things around. That's an easy fix for the backgrounds. I also added a few more splatters to bring in even more texture. In case you don't know, I'm teaching in the Badass Art Journal workshop this year, and you have still time in January to sign up for the early bird prize. The class starts, I think, February 2nd, if I'm not wrong. And yeah, we are a bunch of artists sharing our passion for art journaling and some, I think, inspiring techniques that you can use in yours. I will give you the link in the description and you can jump over and check out the details. Now for my final layers, the Distress Oxides are coming in. I'm using the stencils with them, and what I'm going to do is I ink up the stencil with the oxide ink, and then I give it a spritz of water and make a texture onto the background. I decided to go with the same stencil I've used for the ghosty texture, and in this case I'm using that mini dotted texture stencil. It's a bit messy and I hope it will do the job, but it's not a problem at all. I have some acrylic paint on it. And here I'm using, I think, the worn lipstick in the oxide version. I always pick colors that are already on the background. I would not, or usually I would not introduce a new color, maybe another color, but in the same color range, color family. And now I'm dipping the stencil onto the card, and I use a paper towel to immediately soak up the excess that comes out at the stencil, so I don't get a mess. And I also don't get that messy hands. And yeah, and whenever I want, I can use a brush with water or pick up some of the ink from the stencil and add and move the pigments around to change the way this appears. I'm doing it here, for example. And that works quite nicely because the oxides are opaque. I think that's not a word in English. They are more opaque, and you can layer them over the top, even a lighter color over a darker color. They will not show up 100% in their own color if you use a darker color, but they will show up and they create really interesting effects. I'm always picking the stencil that I had on the background. I'm doing the same here. I just have a look which stencil that was, and then I'm deciding which color I want to add to that background. I think the worn lipstick is the most used today. I'm not sure which color I'm using here. That might be the crushed olive in the oxide version. That's also a really nice spring color. It's not as bright as other colors. It's a bit more dusky, but it's a light and bright color. I think for this one I'm going with the forest moss. Yeah, it was a bit hard to get that stencil inked up. I think it might be easier to do it with the minis, but I think I don't have a forest moss in the mini oxide version. I think I have 12 of the minis and oxides, and I didn't buy them. Well, not the first reason I bought them was not because I want to use them for stamping and card making, but I really like them sometimes to use them as in my sketchbook for drawing and to create backgrounds there or lay down bigger areas of color. And it's really nice if you have a small ink pad because you can then paint with the ink pad directly on the paper, and it's also more portable. So usually I have my sketchbook out with me. I take it on holidays with a lot of materials, and that makes it a bit easier. I really like that texture here. The forest moss was definitely the right decision. I wanted to switch things up, and I think for this background I'm going for the picked raspberry in the oxide version to bring in a little bit more pink because I really like the combination of pink with that green. I think that's a really lovely color and also a perfect spring combo, just as the light blue with the yellowish orangish colors. And I'm using the mini cross-it stencil. And again, I'm moving the pigments around if I need to. And here you can see I'm putting the oxide over the darker forest moss. And this shows up, and when it's dry, it shows up even a bit more because the white comes out once the ink is dry. I'm working my way through the cards now with this technique. I think I add this kind of texture to every card. Here we're coming to that background again that was too much autumnal and also a little bit boring, and I decided to go in with a really dark color, and I'm using Distress Ink in this case because it's just darker than Oxide, and I'm using the Walnut stain to bring in some contrast. And I think finally that background turned out quite lovely, but just not for spring themed cards. This was also background I think was a little bit boring finally, and I added the forest moss in the Distress Oxide version, and it's a bit too light I think. So I'm going in with the same color just in the ink version and add a little bit more texture to bring in more contrast, and I think that was definitely the right decision. I'm done now with all my backgrounds. I will now give you a flip through so you can have a look at the finished backgrounds. You will also find photos over on our shop blog. I will give you the link in the video description. I hope you enjoyed that video and you are a little bit inspired to get out your distress inks, and hopefully we will see us next time. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Bye.